Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are around the world today. Welcome to today's Scrum Pulse webinar. I'm Lindsay Velasina from Scrum.org, and I will be your moderator today. And today we have professional Scrum Trainer Mary Iqbal, and she's going to share common Scrum myths and how to correct them. Looking forward to a great conversation today. And here's the next slide. So your microphones will be muted throughout, and that does not mean that we don't want you to ask questions. So please be sure to ask your questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. That's where we will be monitoring the questions. And in case you miss anything, the session will be recorded. So that will be available within 24 hours along with the slide deck. So don't worry if you miss anything, you'll be able to reference back to it. Next slide, please. Okay, just a little bit about Scrum.org. We are the home of Scrum. We were founded by Ken Schwaber in 2009, and we offer professional Scrum training and certification. We have over 340 professional Scrum trainers like Mary around the globe, and they all teach the same consistent message and materials for a very consistent learning experience. Along with that, we like to help you along your learning journey, and we offer lots of free resources like this webinar on our website, so please be sure to check those out beyond this webinar, and I hope that this session helps you on your learning journey. And with that, I will hand it over to Mary.
All right, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you all for being here today. My name is Mary Iqbal. I am the Agile Transformation Manager at WPS Health Insurance based in Madison, Wisconsin. WPS Health Insurance is one of the largest health benefits providers in the state of Wisconsin. We are a not-for-profit organization with more than 4,000 employees, and we offer health plans to the public and private sectors. I am also a professional Scrum trainer with Scrum.org, and I'm the founder of Rebel Scrum, and I teach both public and private classes. My upcoming classes include Professional Scrum Product Owner on March 17th and 18th, and Professional Agile Leadership scheduled for 4 half days from noon to 4 on 4 p.m. Central Standard Time on March 21st through the 24th, and finally Professional Scrum Master 2 on April 16th and 17th. So I'd like to start our conversation today talking a little bit about the growth of Agile adoption, just generally in the industry today. You can see before you figures taken from the 14th and 15th annual State of Agile report from Digital AI. These figures are taken from 2020 and 2021. The new report should be coming out in April of this year. So I'll be excited to see whether this growth trend has continued. But you can see from these figures, the adoption of Agile has been growing significantly in recent years. In 2020, for example, within the software development industry, the adoption of Agile grew a stunning from 37% to 86%. And then in IT generally grew from 26% to 63%, and operations, et cetera. As you can see consistently across the board, we almost doubled in our adoption of Agile across the various industries. I think a lot of that had to do with my speculation of COVID, but also it had to do with the fact that Agile is, I like to think of Agile as coming of age at this point. The Agile Manifesto was written 21 years ago. Scrum has been around a little bit longer than that, and it has been growing consistently year over year. Now, Scrum is consistently the most popular of all the frameworks within the Agile umbrella. Scrum is a very minimalist framework in the sense that it provides just enough structure, but not too much. I like to think of it as the Goldilocks of the Agile frameworks. Just enough, but not too much structure. Scrum consists of 3 roles, 3 artifacts, and 5 events, and the interactions that govern between them. And that's it. With the rapid adoption of Agile that we've seen in recent years, I think a lot of those folks who are using Agile and using Agile frameworks have not yet been trained in Agile or may not have all received training. So as a result of this rapid adoption of Scrum and various Agile frameworks, I think a lot of myths have come to the fore. So what we're going to do today is we're going to talk about some of the most common myths that I hear in my day-to-day work. So let's start with the first one. best way to get work done is to start it earlier. This is a very common one, and it's something that comes from a lot of our backgrounds. We all come to Scrum from different paths, different ways of working, and we all come to it with our own history with us. So a lot of us come to it and we say, if you want to get something done faster, it's better to start it earlier. Seems logical, but it's actually not. So what I want to talk about is limiting work in progress. Actually, the best way to get work done faster is not to start it all earlier in one lump, but it's actually to limit the work in progress, limit the amount of work that we're doing at one time. So if you think about it, right? If you had a bunch of boulders that you wanted to push, let's say across the field instead of downhill, if you had a team of folks and they all focused on all of the boulders at once, you wouldn't get very far. But if you had that whole team of folks work together and move that one boulder, just one at a time, you're going to get done a lot faster than if you start them all at once. That's what we're talking about when we say it's not getting the work started earlier, it's concentrating on one thing at a time, limiting our work in progress and focusing our work and our effort on one thing at a time. So there's a great study in the book Kanban by David Anderson that talks about this idea of limiting our work in progress. So in this particular case study, there were two teams, Team A and Team B, and they were both approximately the same size. They both worked on pretty much the same sort of work, but one team limited their work in progress to between 5 to 10 items at any given time. And the other team limited their work in progress, didn't really limit their work in progress at all, and had about 80 things that they were actively working on. The team that had 80 things that they were actively working on had a lead time of about 3 months from start to complete. And the team that limited their work in progress had a lead time between 5 to 10 days. So this is just one of many stark examples of the impact that limiting work in progress can have on your team. What does that mean for Scrum, right? Because a lot of you are thinking to yourselves, well, that's Kanban. What does that mean for Scrum? So I've shown here an example from our professional Scrum with Kanban class from Scrum.org. And it talks about what does it mean for Scrum? So what it means for Scrum is we don't start everything the first day of the sprint, or we shouldn't start everything the first day of the sprint. So you can see this example of a Scrum board for a team who's visualizing their work. You have on the left-hand side all the product backlog items that have been selected in the sprint, and they've tasked out their work and determined for each product backlog item selected, they have a certain number of tasks that they're planning to achieve. The best teams do not actually start all of their work on day one. If you want to limit your work in progress, instead, what you would do is start some of your work on day one. And then as soon as that work is completed, then start more work and progress through the sprint in a more controlled manner. Rather than trying to do it all at once, think about how do we need to start and how do we need to finish? What is the best order in which to accomplish our work? So how to correct this myth? At the sprint planning meeting, discuss your plan for delivering the product backlog items that have been selected to the sprint. Don't just each one of you go in and start your work, right? Really think about it and be deliberative about what's the best way to accomplish our work. Discuss this at your sprint planning meeting and put together a plan for delivering your work. Another thing that your team can consider doing as a complementary practice is consider setting a limit for your work in progress and measuring metrics such as cycle time and lead time that will tell you how you're performing. So experiment, try this idea of putting in place a limit for your work in progress. So for more on this topic and the different ways that you can implement it for your team, I suggest the Professional Scrum with Kanban class from Scrum.org. Kanban is something, and some of the principles of Kanban are things that you can use on your Scrum team today to make you more effective. So I want to ask you all now to think about, have a moment of introspection and think about, does your team limit your work in progress? So you'll be seeing a poll coming up in just a moment here on your screens that's going to give you the option to share with us whether your team is limiting your work in progress today within whatever team you're working on, Scrum, Kanban, whatever framework that you're using today.
Okay, that poll is launched. We'll let those results come in. And as those come in, Mary, let's take a question from the audience. So this question is directly related to the example that you shared. So they asked, the 5 to 10 day lead time, was that for individual items? And what was the completion for each of the teams for the full backlog? Do you have those numbers?
So I do. So the 5 to 10 days was an average across all of their product backlog items. So it wasn't for the individual tasks. It was the average across product backlog items. I think he did that average over, I'd have to confirm, but I think it was over a month was the average. But I didn't understand the second half of the question.
Okay, so the second half was, so what was the completion for each of the teams for the full backlog? And do you have those numbers?
Great. So actually they did share a product backlog. That's what makes the improvement a little bit stark. They were both teams that were working from the same product backlog. The lead time refers to how much time it took from when a product backlog item was started to when it was completed for each team.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. All right, we're going to end the poll. And keep your questions coming. We will hopefully have some time at the end, and if not, we will share these questions with Mary to address. So let's share our results here. Okay.
Interesting. Okay, so it looks like we got pretty close to a 50-50 split on whether teams are limiting work in progress or not. I just want to remind you that this is a complementary practice. I started the beginning of our course talking about, or the beginning of our discussion today, talking about the fact that Scrum is a very minimalist framework. So I want to be careful to state that some of these things that we're talking about are suggestions. Limiting work in progress is not something that you have to do, but it's something that you could consider doing to improve the effectiveness of your team. And as we go throughout the rest of the day today, I'll be pointing out those things that are suggestions and those things that are either part of the Scrum framework or are clearly complementary practices. So let's move on to our next Scrum myth. So this one's very near and dear to my heart. So the myth is velocity is part of Scrum and it's the best way to measure team performance. So that is the myth. In actuality, velocity is not a part of Scrum. Velocity is actually a complementary practice that is used for planning purposes only. It's something that teams can do if they wish to do so. So let's take a moment first before we go much further and define velocity. What do I mean when I say velocity? Velocity is measured as the number of points that can be closed per sprint. It actually can be measured different ways depending on the way your team sizes your stories. But the most commonly used ways of velocity is the number of points closed on average per sprint. So let's say that your team is using points to estimate their work, which is actually a complementary practice. If they have pointed on average each of 10 stories to be about 10 points each, and they close each one of those 10 stories in the sprint, then their velocity would be 100 points per sprint on average. So you can see here, this is a sample of what velocity might look like for a sample team. And over time, how many points that sample team has closed per sprint. So for example, in this sample velocity, you can see in sprint 1, the team closed about 34 points. And in the next sprint, they close, let's say around 38 points. And it varies over time. That's what velocity is. I think a lot of folks have gotten the impression that velocity is a requirement for Scrum, and that is not the case. Velocity is a planning tool that teams can decide to use, or they may not decide to use velocity. And I think the other thing about velocity is, even for those teams who have decided to use it, the use or the purpose of velocity can be confusing. Sometimes management will think that velocity is something that is used to measure the performance of the team. And a lot of folks think that velocity should be continually improving, otherwise the team's not getting better. But that's not actually the case. Velocity is just a tool. And the right way to use velocity is to plan how much work you can pull into the next sprint. So for example, in my sample from above, if the team is pulling or completing an average of 35 points per sprint, they may choose to pull in 35 points in the next sprint. that's what it's for. It's not intended to be a measure of team performance. I think this point is very, very critical for folks to understand. So rather than using velocity to measure team performance, what do you do? How do you correct this myth? So the first way to correct this myth is simple education, right? What is velocity? It's not a measure of team performance. And instead of using velocity for team performance, what should you measure? Where each team has to have this discussion for themselves. Each team has to think about, how do we track outcomes and not just the outputs of our work? So what I mean by that, how do we really find metrics that measure progress and actual team performance, and also measure progress against the product goal? So we do have 2 classes at Scrum.org that have some great discussions on this topic. There is the Professional Agile Leadership Essentials class, which discusses from a leader's perspective, how do I know if my Scrum team's performing well? And what are good metrics to track team performance? And the second course that we have that speaks specifically on metrics and the different types of metrics and what they measure is the Professional Agile Leadership class that focus on evidence-based management, so the EBM class. But here's a few samples that are discussed really or brought up in really both classes. What are some things that you could measure to measure the performance of your team? You could measure quality. You could measure customer satisfaction, team morale. Also track whether the team is delivering a done increment, which meets the sprint goal. You could look at lead time. How much time does it take from when an item is requested to when it is delivered? You could look at return on investments, product ratings, the number of defect trends. All of these things are great things to track. But one thing I caution on all of your metrics, it's not just the metric that matters, it's the conversation around the metric. The metric itself doesn't have meaning without the context. So if you're tracking customer satisfaction, what is the context of that? If you're tracking team morale, what's the context of that? All of the metrics are indicators, but they don't tell the full story. So for more on this conversation, I recommend either one of those Professional Agile Leadership classes as a great way to further the conversation around how do we measure what really matters instead of just measuring outputs or outputs. So with that, I want to ask another poll. Does your team measure value?
One moment here. Okay. Poll is launched. And it looks like we have some questions that came in. Let's skim through these quick.
Okay.
Here's an interesting one, Mary. How do we track team morale?
So there's lots of different ways to do that. I would actually suggest that your team consider what's the best way to do that. Your organization consider what's the best way to do that. You can do anonymous surveys would be one way to do it. Some teams even just do sort of a sentiment. How did you feel about the previous sprint, and track that over time so they can discuss it at the retrospective. Again, some teams will do anonymous surveys on a regular basis. Some teams will be doing anonymous surveys, quarterly, monthly. It really is up to you. But those are some really common ways to track that information.
Okay, great. So let's have a look at our poll here. Going to end it and then share. And there we have it.
I'm not surprised to hear these figures. It's I think something that's not commonly done yet. I think there's an evolution with Scrum teams. When a team first forms, there's things that is common to that. And one of those things that's common is not tracking value metrics. I think for a lot of teams, another interesting question would have been, which I don't want to bring this up, is, are you tracking outputs, right? Are there things that you're tracking that maybe you shouldn't be tracking? I would wager that that's probably the case here. A lot of newer Scrum teams, get started, which is fantastic, right? You should get started, and then you're going to improve from there. But a lot of the newer Scrum teams do tend to track things that are more based on outputs, like how many how many, widgets, I don't know, things that are less valuable. So I'm not surprised to hear this. I would encourage you at your upcoming retrospective to talk about what are some things that we could track that really are more value oriented and that measure our progress as a team. So for example, quality or customer satisfaction. And then those things that you are tracking, bring them back to the team and share those results on a regular basis so that the team can learn over time. That's what Scrum's all about. One of the great things about Scrum is the ability to learn over time. All right, so thank you all for that. All right, let's move on to myth number 3. Scrum teams should focus on one technology area for maximum efficiency. So what do I mean by that? That's a lot of words and a lot of syllables. Here's what I mean by that. If you look at, this is just a sample for a technology organization or a technology-based organization. If you think of a website, for example, the website has the user interface, right? And there's a team of people who might focus on that. There's a team of people who might focus on the database and the data storage. And then all those different teams in between that focus on moving data back and forth or storing data. And a lot of times what organizations will do that move towards Agile is they'll take those teams and they make them Agile within their current frameworks. But a better path is actually to look at those teams and think about what is the product that we're all together servicing, and then form cross-functional teams that may cross technology areas, but which are all focused around the same product. So it's a really important conversation to have within your organization is, are we focused on the right thing? Are we focused on our product, or are we too focused on the technology? And what is the better way to structure our team? So here's what I mean by that from a more of a practical, less theoretical standpoint, right? If you think about on the left-hand side, you might have multiple teams, each one focused on a different technology. So for example, let's say there might be a Java team, and there might be a SQL team, and there might be a team focused on EDI. And each team might be separate. But let's have the conversation within your organizations. What is the product, and does that product cross technologies? And if so, do we need to create a more cross-functional team? So this is an important conversation to have. And the way to correct this myth of the technology teams is to really start by defining your product. Start with the customer. So this is a complicated subject. So for more conversation around this, I recommend the Professional Scrum Product Owner class. And also the Scale Professional Scrum class has a further discussion around this. But ask yourselves, who is our customer? And are we really organized in the best way to solve value for that customer? Or have we created unnecessary silos within our organization? This is something that only you can decide independently through conversations within your organization. But I definitely recommend the Professional Scrum Product Owner class for a little bit further discussion around this. And the Scale Professional Scrum class has further discussion around this topic. So let me ask you a question now. Has your Scrum team defined products, or has your organization defined what is the product and who is our customer? Have you put some thought into this question?
Okay, and that poll is launched. While we are gathering that, wow, there are lots of questions coming in here. Let's see. How about this question from Andy here? How do you migrate to Scrum and continue to deliver at the same or faster rate? What's the key?
That's a great question. I thought you were going to ask how you define your products, which, by the way, we do discuss in Stop Pretending to Be Agile, which is my previous webinar. We do discuss how to define your products, but how do you navigate to Scrum and maintain your current velocity? The question there is a great question. So the first thing I think you need to focus on is forming your teams, defining your product, and then getting started. As you get started, start your first Scrum team by delivering something of value. Start your first sprint by delivering something of value. You don't need to deliver the entire kitchen sink, but you're delivering value incrementally every sprint. And with each sprint, you're going to ask yourself, how did that go? Was there anything that we could have done better? And then you're going to do that, right? Take 1 or 2 improvement ideas and implement those in your next sprint. And then in the sprint after that, take 1 or 2 improvement ideas, think about how it went and implement those. So I think the best tip I can give you is get started, get your team trained, identify the accountabilities, who's going to play each accountability, the Scrum Master, product owner, the developers, and then simply get started and focus on delivering value in increments, not the full, it doesn't have to be the whole kitchen sink, but something that is of value every sprint. Then every sprint, ask yourselves, how did it go? All right, so let's move on then, but think about and ask yourselves that question. Have you defined your products? All right, so let's move on to the next myth, one of my favorites. Scrum has too many meetings. I hear this one a lot. When you first start Scrum, it can look overwhelming, right? When you see it on the screen, there's 5 events. That sounds like a lot, but it's really not. The 5 events within Scrum are, first off, the sprint, which is the container event for the other events. And then you have the sprint planning meeting, which is the first event within the sprint. This is the event where you're going to plan out how are you going to accomplish the work of the sprint? What is our sprint goal? And what are the product backlog items that we're going to select for the sprint? So this is one happens once during the sprint. And then you have your daily Scrum, which is a 15-minute touch base for the developers only. Then concluding at the very end of the sprint, you have the sprint review, where you meet with your customers and you show what was delivered. And then you have your sprint retrospective, where the Scrum team discusses how did it go. So it can look like a lot on paper, but it's really not. If you think about a 2-week sprint, you're starting with sprint planning, you're ending with sprint review and sprint retrospective, and then you've got that daily Scrum in between. It's really not a lot when you're practicing it. In practice, it's a daily 15-minute meeting. And those events really, truly eliminate or greatly reduce the need for other meetings. So I can tell you from my experience, right? Before I started using Scrum, you might have developers suffer in silence for weeks. There might be meetings that happen that are just we've waited too long and an issue has just really bubbled up and become this nightmare thing that's a little bit bigger than it needed to be. These events within Scrum really greatly reduce that. So the daily Scrum, you're identifying and escalating impediments. You're talking about how's it going daily, every day. So no one's suffering in silence. Issues are not allowed to grow to become unmanageable. And then the other events, how did it go? Here's what we delivered. What did you think? And then how can we get better? These things actually greatly reduce the necessity for other meetings. So in practice, when you start using Scrum, you will find that the number of meetings that you're attending as a developer or as a product owner, as a Scrum Master, are really reduced by these events. So let me ask you guys, how to correct this myth. Time box, right? These events do need to be time boxed. So for example, the sprint itself needs to be 1 month or less. The sprint planning meeting, time box it at 8 hours. Usually it's going to be less if your sprint is less than a month. The daily Scrum, it's really important that you time box that at 15 minutes. I have seen teams that are not time boxing that, and then it can become very painful. So as the Scrum Master needs to make sure that these events take place, that they're positive, that they're productive, that they are kept within the time box is really important. Otherwise, it can become very onerous. If your daily 15 minutes is turning into an hour, then you definitely need to think about how can we achieve a better control of our time box. All right, so let me ask you a question. Does your team actually time box the events? Are you time boxing your daily Scrum to 15 minutes? Are you time boxing the sprint planning meeting to 8 hours?
Okay, so that is launched. While we're collecting those answers, there are a couple of questions that came in about refinement.
Okay.
So this first one here that came in, it says Scrum does not say refinement is mandatory, but it consumes a lot of time. What are your thoughts on refinement? And then the other question is, the Scrum Guide doesn't recommend how much time should be spent on refinement. Mm-hmm. Is there a recommendation for that?
Great questions. So first off, you're absolutely correct that refinement is not a required activity in Scrum. It is a required activity if you go to Nexus, which is a way to scale Scrum. It's the simplest way to scale Scrum. And then refinement does become something that is part of the framework. But to your point, yes, refinement is optional for Scrum teams. Scrum teams, each team has to independently decide how much of our time are we going to spend on refinement and what does that look like? So for example, some teams will have a meeting, right, where they talk about refining the product backlog. So what is refinement? Refinement is the process of adding detail, order, and sizing to product backlog items so that they're ready for the next sprint. Time spent in refinement is really invaluable because it's going to accelerate your performance in the next event. So back to that previous question, how do we make sure that we continue to deliver value when you move to Scrum? One great way to do that is to think about refinement and make sure that those refinement events are efficient. So 10% of your time on refinement is not unreasonable. There's no time box for this event, but 10% is not unreasonable. And when you think about that, 10%, if your team decides that refinement should be something that everyone participates in, that's 4 hours per person, right, per week. So think about that, right? That's if you're saying to yourself, 10% of that sounds reasonable. That's how much we're talking about is 4 hours per week. But again, it's not time boxed. Every team has to decide how they're going to do it. So I just would urge you to do spend time on refinement. It's invaluable time. It's time that is going to accelerate you in the future. It's definitely not a waste of time. And refinement is not just the meetings that take place. Refinement is also going out there and doing the research on each of the product backlogs that are higher ordered in the product backlog, doing some research, doing some looking and consideration and thinking about each of those product backlog items and how can we use those product backlog items to maximize the value of the product.
Thanks, Mary. Okay, so let me end the poll here. I'm going to share our results.
Okay.
And there we have it.
Fantastic. That is great news. All right. Well, then I think we can move on to our next myth. So that's fantastic. Great figures. I think that's really great. Okay. All right. Let's go then to our final myth, which is, again, one of my favorites, is we can't break this product backlog item down any smaller because then we might have to return to the same part of the code later, and that's wasteful. Now, for this particular myth, I think they're all right. They're all coming from the right place. We're all trying to do better. And this one is a common one that I hear for newer Scrum teams and even teams who have been practicing Scrum for a long time. They're thinking that if I break this product backlog item very small, then I'm going to have to come back to that particular module of the code. And the thing is, that's true, right? If you do break down your product backlog items so that each one is relatively small and delivers a unit of value, there is a chance that you're going to have to come back to the same area of the code. But I would submit to you that almost no matter what, you'll be coming back to that part of the code at some point in the future. So if you think about it, if you look at this visual that I'm providing, I'm showing a sample product backlog item, and I'm showing, in this case, a software team, but you could generalize this to say human resources or marketing. And I'm saying here that, the items in orange impact module B, or if you're human resources, may impact hiring, or if you're marketing, well, that might impact the sales team, for example. The items in orange are just saying that we impact a certain area of the system. And you may be saying to yourself, yeah, if you combine, if you have them separately, we're going to be going back to the same modules over and over again. And the answer is yes. But if you were to go through and combine these based on their impacts, then what's going to happen is, in effect, we're all of a sudden ordering the product backlog by module or impact area instead of allowing the product owner to order the work based on what's the most valuable thing to do next. So you need to be careful when you're thinking about how big to make your product backlog items. Am I making them too big to try and minimize impacts or combine impacts? If you're doing that, then you're really taking some of the accountability away from the product owner. So I think this next really, to me, really tells that full story, right? Let's imagine for a moment that you have gone ahead and combined these items, right? Then you've got this really big product backlog item that includes some really important features, some that are not as relevant, but they're all in the same area of the code. So we put them all together, right? And we're working on delivering that huge product backlog items. There may be other work that was more important. right? That we're not focusing on because we're trying to artificially organize our work to minimize impacts or to minimize going back to that same area of the code again. It's not efficient, right? It may look from from the forest versus the trees, right? It may look when you're zooming in, oh, that's more efficient. But when you think about the bigger picture, it's really not the most efficient way to deliver value to the company or to your organization. So I encourage you, when you're looking at your product backlog and you're conducting those refinement meetings with about 10% of your time, really think about, can we cut this work any smaller? Can we make it so that each product backlog item delivers a unit of value, right? It's developed, it's tested, it's complete, and itself provides value. But it's as small as possible. It's small enough that it can be completed within one sprint. And it's not just about prioritizing the work. Organizing your work this way and delivering smaller units of value will help the team to uncover unexpected issues earlier than if you had cut them a little bit smaller. So for example, in this little kind of cartoon I put together, the team is delivering a larger product backlog items and comes up against an unexpected technical issue. If the team had cut their work a little bit smaller, they may have found out about the technical issue earlier. So for example, an imaginary situation might be a team who was delivering a web form. The web form includes, building the user interface and also creating the fields and saving them to a database. If you had delivered your work in smaller chunks, you might find out earlier that the fields don't actually save to the database. It's a lot better to find that out with 5 fields than after I've built this form field with 5,000 fields on it. It's a lot better to find out the work earlier. So it's about prioritization, it's about risk mitigation, it's about delivering value sooner. It's not the ideal way to work to try and deliver value in huge chunks. You want to deliver that work in smaller increments if possible. So how to correct this myth? In your refinement, when you're spending 10% of your time in refinement or more, depending on your team, higher order product backlog items should be sized so they can be completed within one sprint. Even if more than one developer needs to work on it, they need to be sized so that they can be completed within one sprint. You don't want to have a product backlog item that's so huge that it can't possibly be completed within the sprint, even if you had your whole team working on it. That product backlog item is too big. Developers should also collaborate with the product owner to maximize the value of the product. They need to come and give suggestions. How can we break these product backlog items down smaller? What's the most important thing? Is there a better way to do this that might be quicker? And then keep in mind, developers are accountable for sizing those product backlog items. The product owner is not most of the time going to know how much work goes into each item on the product backlog. That's up to the developers to give that input. So there is a balancing act where the product owner is collaborating with the product owners, coming up with the ideas for the things that we can put on the product backlog. The developers are coming at it saying, okay, well, that thing's too big. Is there a better way to do it? Can we cut it up smaller? That collaboration is what makes that product backlog a valuable to-do list for the team. It can't be something that the developers create on their own or that the product owner creates on their own. That's something that they need to work together on to maximize that value of the product and to make sure that we're delivering value incrementally in small pieces, sprint by sprint. So I'm going to ask you guys, I think it's the final poll of today, really ask yourselves, are the higher ordered product backlog items right sized? When you're coming into the sprint planning meeting, do you have enough work for the sprint, which is sized so that it can really be realistically completed within the sprint? I'm actually quite eager to hear your thoughts on this and what the percentage comes out to be.
Okay, so while we are waiting on that, here is a question from Emily. Emily asks, what if splitting a backlog item makes the split parts not individually deliverable?
Great question, Emily. You do need to split your stories so that each one provides a unit of value. So what I mean is, you do not want to split your stories so that you're doing development in one product backlog item and testing in another product backlog item. By the way, Emily, I think you used the word stories. Stories is a complementary practice that is used.
She didn't. She actually used backlog item.
Oh, did she? Okay, I switched it then. stories is a commonly used method for writing product backlog items. But you do need to ensure that your product backlog item delivers a unit of value. You don't want to cut it up focused on how you're delivering it. You want to cut up that story or that product backlog item so that it delivers a unit of value, regardless of how it's delivered. So just keep in mind when you're conducting that refinement with your team, it's really about the value that's provided. When you're cutting up the stories, don't cut them up based on how you're going to deliver it. It is a subtle difference, but it's an important one.
Great, thanks, Mary. Okay, I'm going to end our poll. I'm going to share it here, and it is pretty much down the middle.
Okay. All right. So if I was to recommend which one of the myths that I would attack first, it would be this one of all of them. Because if you think about the Scrum Guide, it discusses the fact that Scrum is used for iterative incremental product delivery. You're not delivering incrementally if your product backlog items are sized too large. So back to our very early question, how do we make sure that we're still delivering value? It's making sure that we have, I think one of the most important things is making sure that we have a well-refined product backlog item and that those items are sized appropriately. So of all of the myths today, I think I'd recommend starting here. All right, so thank you for that. And that actually concludes our session for today. I'm gonna see if we have, I think we have a few minutes for questions. So I'm gonna pass the ball back to Lindsay.
Okay. So thank you all for all these great questions that have come in. Very, very interactive audience today. There is a question that came in from Paula regarding some metrics that I wanted to bring up. She asks, how do I help my Scrum Masters when they ask what are useful metrics to present to the customers and leadership? Should I emphasize that this should really be for the teams only?
Great question. So I would say that the customer and leadership are interested, yes, in metrics. And they're interested in metrics that represent what kind of value is the team delivering. So I would recommend thinking about what is the product goal. So back to kind of basics, one of the 3 artifacts in Scrum is a product backlog. And that product backlog does include not only product backlog items, but it also includes what's the product goal. So I would ask you to think about what's the product goal and what kind of metrics that you could measure that deliver progress against that goal. So for example, let's imagine that your product is a website and the product goal is to sell $1 million this year. Then you might want to be measuring sales, right? One of those things could be sales that you're measuring, or you might want to measure things that are related to sales, like shopping cart abandonment rate, or the number of visits to the product details page, or any number of different metrics that measure progress against the goal of the product. So especially from the leadership perspective and the customer perspective, those are maybe not the customer in this particular instance, but from the customer's perspective and the leadership perspective, measuring those particular goals that represent value. So for example, customer satisfaction would be an important one for customers that might be interested in. So I would definitely encourage you to think about what value that I'm providing and what are metrics that measure value delivery, and then reporting those metrics to the Scrum team and also to leadership and where appropriate to the customer.
Great, thanks, Mary. So this next question. Hi, Mary, you mentioned forming teams. What could be the activities in the team when a new person joins? I am referring to the team stages by Tuckman, meaning the team kind of goes back to a stage or two when a new person, sorry, I totally butchered that, goes back a stage or two when a new person joins. So how to get back to performing?
Okay, so great question. So the questioner is referring to Tuckman's model, which consists of forming, storming, norming, and performing in that order. So when a new team forms, they start off in the forming stage, right? And then they move on kind of up the scale, forming, storming, norming, performing. anytime a new team member joins the team, so let's imagine that you have a Scrum team that's been in operation or been working together for a year, and then you add a new person to the mix. That team really goes back to the forming stage at that point. And then they move on to the storming phase where they're trying to figure out how to work together. And the way that you can, the goal, right, in that model is to get to the performing stage. So you want to go through that forming and storming and norming as quickly as possible. And there are some complementary practices in Scrum that can help you achieve that. So the one that most comes to mind for me, the complementary practice, is team agreements. You might consider team agreements as a way to help make your teams move through those tuck-in stages a little bit more quickly. So a team agreement, again, is a complementary practice, and it describes things like how does the team work together? Things like when are the events going to be, right? What time does the daily Scrum happen? But also things like how do we handle conflict as a team? What is our expectations in terms of attendance at the daily Scrum? Or attendance at the sprint planning meeting? Are we all gonna, are we gonna be 5 minutes late? Is that acceptable? Or do we all need to arrive on time? All those sort of things are spelled out in the team agreements. I do think that's a helpful way to help ensure that teams move through the forming, storming phases a little bit more quickly. Another suggestion that I would have for you is think about the Scrum values and how do you live those values? I think a discussion on the Scrum values on a regular basis would be something fantastic to help improve team performance and also build trust among team members, which in itself helps you become a higher performing team. So discuss the Scrum values on a regular basis, maybe once a quarter at your sprint retrospective event, and ask yourselves, are we living those values? And are there ways that we can live those values better?
Great, thanks, Mary. Okay, this next question, is it a good practice to place the sprint retrospective and sprint planning in the same day, one before the other? Is that a good practice? What do you recommend for when to do your events?
So it is completely up to the team. Scrum does not dictate that. So I would say ask your team, discuss it at the retrospective. Do they feel that it's too much to do in one day? Or do they feel that they want to do it together so as to be more efficient, right? It's really up to the team. I've seen teams do it on the same day and I've seen them do it on separate days, and every team has a different opinion on that. So I would say I can't even give a recommendation. My suggestion is to ask your team at the retrospective, take a vote and go with the majority on that, and then discuss it. Don't change it up too frequently because it's, it can be confusing if the events are moving around all the time, but ask your team and go with the majority's vote on that one, and then ask them again and see how it's going. I've done both ways, both have their merits.
Great, thank you. This next question, what exactly do you discuss in the daily Scrum?
So one of the, I'm just kind of laughing because that's one of the things I discussed in one of my myth articles. So it's up to the team, right? The purpose of the daily Scrum is it's an event for the developers. And the purpose of the daily Scrum is to increase the likelihood of delivering a done increment which meets the sprint goal. So a lot of teams do different things. Like some teams will ask, we'll do a sort of a round robin event. And some teams will ask each person to speak to, what did you do yesterday? What did you do? What are you going to do today? And do you have any blockers? And each developer goes around sort of in round robin fashion and speaks to those 3 topics. That's a very common way to do it. Another way to do it is simply sort of a free form where you walk they call it walking the board, where each developer speaks to the product backlog items that they're working on. Other teams leave it even more free form and just say, how's it going? How are we doing? Are we on track to meet the sprint goal, or are we not? However you do it is up to your team, but what you want to achieve is transparency on progress towards that sprint goal. How's it going? How are we progressing towards the sprint goal? And are there changes that we need to make in the sprint backlog to increase our likelihood of delivering that sprint goal? So when in doubt, newer Scrum teams frequently use the 3 questions, but I encourage you to keep in mind the purpose of the meeting. It's not just to answer those 3 questions, it's to determine how are we doing, and to determine if we need to make changes in order to meet that sprint goal.
Great, thank you. A couple more questions here. I'm going to go back to some about metrics. I just want to reiterate to the audience, there were an overwhelming number of questions that had come in. They're all going to be shared with Mary afterwards. So if we do not get to your question, it doesn't mean you aren't important. So they will be addressed in some way, shape, or form. Just wanted to let everybody know that. So this question, how can we use quantitative metrics to measure qualitative items, quality, value, morale, etc.? And how can we link this to team performance?
Okay, great question.
And they're looking for examples.
Looking for examples. Okay. All right. So if you want to measure quality, quality depends on the product that you're delivering. So for example, if your quality is a website, quality might include things like, was the data passed in the shopping cart correctly to the database, for example? Were the address information correct? So quality can be a very, you can think of it as a qualitative, but there are quantitative measures to measure that. So for example, number of defects found in production. That's a very quantitative way to measure quality. Another way to measure, another kind of qualitative thing that you can measure quantitatively is employee morale. For example, the two ways I thought of it is asking anonymous survey on a regular basis, and then look at your trends. Are they getting better or are they getting worse? Right? So if you start at a 3 out of 5 in terms of how happy I'm here to work here, is that number getting better over time or is it getting worse? That's how I would recommend looking at something that's qualitative and then putting together quantitative measurements that measure it. Look over time how you're trending on those measurements. It can be as simple as asking your customer on a regular basis, on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with our product? And then measuring that over time, asking that question again over time. There's lots of different ways to measure these sort of qualitative measures. You might look at net promoter scores in order to measure customer satisfaction. So do some Googling on that would be another great way. Did that answer that question?
Well, if it hasn't, please come back to us with a follow-up.
Okay.
Okay, so this question from Linda. When we say a backlog item is sized, is it better to use points or estimated effort in hours?
That is a great question. So there's really 3 ways you can size your stories. You can use hours, you can use points, or another way that you can plan your work is to use flow metrics. So I think it is up to the team. I would recommend against using hours though, because hours is not taking into account the full picture. When you estimate a product backlog item in terms of hours, you're thinking just of the number of hours. But what if a new developer takes on that story or product backlog item? Or what if you have a senior, somebody with more experience that takes on that product backlog item for delivery? Then your hours are immediately wrong. So a better way to estimate, better than hours, would be to use points. Points take into account comparative, right? They're not, it's 5 hours for this particular product backlog item. It's instead compared to other work, is this bigger or smaller? So points is a little bit better of a way to plan your work. And it takes out of the wash this idea of who's delivering the product backlog item and instead focuses on average, how much work can a team deliver, regardless of who does what individual product backlog item. So points is better than hours in that way. You could also consider using flow metrics, which instead of using points, it focuses more on how many product backlog items in an average sprint do we typically deliver. So flow metrics it's a whole nother art. You can consider things like making your stories similarly sized and then focusing on just the flow metrics. What's our average lead time? What's our average cycle time? That is the third way you could plan your work. They all have their merits. I would suggest, my only caveat is I would suggest against using hours because it's too, doesn't take into account the many factors that go into a sprint, including who's delivering which item. Points is just a better way to do that, or flow metrics is a better way to plan your work. I do want to mention I am discussing some of this in one of my upcoming articles. So I would encourage you to go out to rebelscrum.site and sign up for our email distribution list. You can find that, sign up on the top level navigation bar, and you can be informed when we come out with new stories that discuss some of these topics that you're asking in these questions that you're, these really great questions that you're surfacing.
And I also encourage all of you to check out the Scrum.org blog, and you can filter to Mary, and you can check out all of the blog articles that she's written. A lot of them point to some of the stuff. So I would definitely recommend checking that out at scrum.org/blog. And with that, so we are coming up on our time box here, and we want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I will share these questions with Mary, and we will figure out a way to address them. Thank you all so much for being such an active audience. We really appreciate it, and we're so glad that it seems that you got some value out of this. So with that, just a reminder, we always encourage you to continue your learning. So with that, we have digital learning paths on Scrum.org, so please check those out. There are lots of free resources on there, including blogs, webinars, podcasts, white papers, case studies, all kinds of things. So please check that out for some additional resources. Next slide. And as we close, we just remind you to always stay connected with us. Our forums are a great place to share problems and things like that and get answers to them. There's also our social media channels and webinars like this one. We run webinars a couple times a month. So please check those out on our website. And with that, I think we had a great session today. Thank you all so much. Thank you, Mary, for your time and sharing your knowledge. We really appreciate that.
All right. Thank you so much for being here, and we appreciated your time and your questions. And thank you, Lindsay, for hosting today's webinar.
Sure. Thank you, everyone, and Scrum on. Bye.